Coming up next is the Dr. Kim Taylor Show. Here's your chance to talk about what matters to you. Although you'll receive helpful advice from Dr. Kim, remember this is not to be construed as any form of psychotherapy, diagnosis, or treatment, and cannot replace a therapeutic relationship with a mental health professional. You can reach Dr. Kim by calling 564-1290 or 866-564-1290. You can also listen live on the internet at drkimtaylorshow.com. Now, here's Dr. Kim.
In today's culture, how do we define real men? It seems that with the changing social expectations around masculinity, and then the conflicting depictions of men in today's media, it really is no surprise that lots of guys these days are having an identity crisis when it comes to how to express their feelings. They learn from a very early age that strength is equated with lack of emotion or vulnerability, and that the only acceptable feelings are really anger, aggression, or violence. So in order to be seen as real men, we encourage them to be stoic and disconnected from their feelings, and to resolve any conflict they have through violence. There was a recent documentary that's called The Mask You Live In, and it really shows how society has a very narrow definition of what it means to be a man. And actually, this very concept is having a lot of unintended consequences that are ranging from men who are more involved with substance abuse or violence or even rape. So today the topic is, how can we raise a healthier generation of young men and create a culture that doesn't leave them feeling so lonely or isolated and detached from their true emotions? Joining me is Dr. Ryan McKelly. He's a psychologist and also an associate professor at the University of Wisconsin-La Crosse. He specializes in the area of men's mental health and changing the gender roles and really working to help young boys become better connected men. So if you have a question or a comment about what it is to be a real man in today's world, give us a call at 805-564-1290 or use my email for your questions at drkim@drkimtaylorshow.com. I'll be right back with my guests after this short break. I'm Dr. Kim Taylor, and you're listening to The Dr. Kim Taylor Show.
You are listening to Dr. Kim Taylor on KZSB AM 1290.
Today the topic is, what is a real man in today's world? And my guest is psychologist Dr. Ryan McKelly, and he's the co-author of several journals and book chapters, mostly in the area of men and masculinity. And he also has a great TEDx talk on helping boys become connected men. So welcome to the program.
Thanks for having me. I appreciate it.
Are we doing something wrong in raising our boys today?
Well, I think this is probably a question we've been asking for as long as we've been raising boys and girls. So, there's no one right way. But if you look at trends in our culture, particularly, and when I say our culture, I really most often talking about American or Western in some cases. We've seen a little bit tendency towards more restricted gender roles for both boys and girls. And so I think with boys, we've particularly with media and how it's kind of permeated in all areas now, that we're seeing just stricter definitions of what boys and men can and cannot do. Some people who study it, sociologists, anthropologists, even psychologists, back in the 70s, a good example would be kids' toys were fairly genderless, and now you walk down the aisle of Target or something, and it's very clear what aisle you're in for boys or girls just based on how we market toys, and then it goes on from there.
We talk a lot about that. It's sometimes harder for men to express themselves, to be in touch with their feelings. How do we really socialize men to mask their emotions?
When I talk to parents about this, I kind of take them along that developmental life cycle, when infants are born, we come into the world with this wide range of emotional expression, and for the most part, we accept it as caregivers and parents. And for the first couple of years of life, you don't see a lot of, or I should say, you see, less restrictions on what we allow babies to express. We let them, joy and sadness and excitement and all kinds of things. The real difference starts to occur around when kids enter that school age, so 5 or 6. And even when you ask little kids across, at kindergarten age and then in grade school, middle school, you see, they develop different ideas about what's acceptable, what isn't. And so when we start to kind of shut down, say, you're too old to cry, you're 6 years old, this is going to hurt you at school or it's going to hurt you in the playground, you cut it out, boys don't cry, and we all hear that cliche. That's when you start to see this split between boys and girls in what we allow them to express.
So
that continues, adolescence and certainly young adulthood. Yeah.
Okay, so they really start out, and boys and girls are really the same in that they are very expressive and they have a wide range. Is it true that as men get older, they feel less emotional, are less emotional than women?
Well, that's certainly been the kind of stereotype, but we've gotten more sophisticated ways to measure emotional experiences, and one of those is just through your physiological response. So, think about what your body does when it gets angry, or what your body does when it's feeling joy and happiness. And so when we ask people's bodies, right, so we hook them up with stuff that can measure those types of responses, we don't see these very clear differences. When you expose people to emotional stimuli to get them to actually feel something, now, men and women in those studies may report and say, I don't feel this or I do feel this, but their physiology tells a different story. And so, it's the idea that men and women are different emotionally. It's not so much that we don't experience emotions. It's just that we have different rules about how and when and what we're allowed to express.
What I know is that you've done a lot of research about this, and this is really your field that you have worked with a lot of men, a lot of boys. Mm-hmm. What I think that might be helpful is to understand what are the emotions that are more acceptable to men to actually express, and how is that different than what we allow women?
Sure. And there's been a series of studies, and I'm sure many of the listeners are aware that you could study things, you get different results. But when you put them all together, and you look even across different ethnic groups in the United States, in general, anger is one of those emotions that I wouldn't say we accept, but we certainly tolerate with men, or at least we're not surprised when men express it. So anger is one of them. Pride is one, and then even loneliness in some studies have popped up. So there's a very clear gender difference, or at least a gender preference that we're allowing men. And then when you look at what we allow women to, you've got joy and compassion and a much wider range when you ask them to self-report on any given day the types of things that they feel. So it's not that we feel different things entirely, express things differently entirely, but we tend to see more displays of anger and pride in men on average than we see in women. In women, we tend to see a much broader range of expressed emotions.
So what we know is that if it's really easy for men to express the anger, always under anger, it's always hurt, that somehow someone has been hurt. And if they're not able to express that hurt, then it is going to come out in that angry way. But why is it so difficult for them to express the hurt? Makes them more vulnerable, more exposed, taking a bigger risk?
The V word. And even when I do clinical work with men, I try to avoid even using it early on in therapy because, a lot of men just bristle at the idea. Because if we equate kind of traditional, hegemonic, kind of those negative aspects of masculinity, being seen as weak is one of the worst things you can be as a boy or a man. And we've taught a fair number of boys and men that showing emotions such as hurt or sadness shows weakness. And then it activates that threat. Well, if I'm perceived as weak, then somebody's going to pull something over on me. And so, just like you had said, rather than feel and connect with and recognize, well, maybe I'm hurt or maybe I'm sad and what's going on here and how can I accept that and learn from it, we instantly, within milliseconds, we're defensive anger because that's something we've seen. That's how we've seen problems solved. whether it's through cartoons or play or I mean, there's no matter where you look, that's like the old movie script. And so I have a lot of empathy for men who respond that way, and it's not because they're incapable of responding any other way. It's just they haven't been taught to, or they haven't seen the benefits of it. And so certainly, yeah, when you feel at risk, that's an easy thing to do, is to just strike out in anger. That's the easiest thing you can do. It doesn't require any reflection. It doesn't require empathy. It doesn't require pause. But if that's your default approach, and certainly there are situations where that may be the acceptable response in the short term, but when we act out with that aggression, it only causes us harm ourselves and then often harm to others.
So just trying to express their anger, that is really safer. It is less risky. But as we all know, or those of us who work with couples, is that it really plays havoc within the relationship. Because if you're only expressing the anger and you're never getting to the hurt, then so much is misunderstood.
Mm-hmm.
Okay.
And so when you think about the things that, in a long-term relationship, even a short-term relationship, and I even encourage people, if you're not in a romantic relationship, think about your friendships. And, what is it that separates that individual from somebody who is an acquaintance or somebody you don't know? Well, you've got some type of emotional connection. Like, you see sides of that person that you don't take the time to see in other people. And now, but if you spend your life masking those parts of yourself, that really puts a limit as to how close you can become with another human being, how connected you can become with them. And so, by defaulting to just a couple different expressions, anger being one of them, you put great distance with other people. And it does cause a lot of relational problems.
Yeah. So as men are really shaped to kind of funnel their feelings and to funnel it into something that is more acceptable either to them or as it is perceived by other people, you talk about this emotional male funnel system and what men really learn to do with their feelings. Could you explain that to us, just to let us know what actually happens?
Sure, and this is one thing I wish I had come up with. But this came out in kind of the early '80s by by the name of Long, and I always tell people, think of this martini glass or a funnel. At the top of that, we're born in the world with this wide range of emotions, and it's not just negative ones. You can throw in positive ones. So we come in the world, we've got a full range of expression, and as we age, particularly with boys, that funnel gets narrower and narrower, and so when you were little, say when you were 2 or 3 and you felt shame or humiliation or whatever it might be, or guilt because of something you did wrong, you were able to express or at least experience that without being punished. As we get older and we're told, no, you can't do that. That's not something you can show because it's going to, you'll show weakness or it's vulnerability. So by the time we reach adolescence and young adulthood, we have basically kind of filtered out there's only just a couple of things that pop out at the end of that funnel, and anger and aggression and hostility are examples of some of those things. And so it really just it limits us into what we have available when we are experiencing things.
The term you use in some of this is also the sissy shaming, or shaming each other for expressing their feelings. What happens to men when they start to feel this happening?
Oh, yeah, I always say shame's a very effective short-term, way to change somebody's behavior. It is not an effective long-term one. And so if it's used repeatedly, we withdraw. And so, and shame's just one of those emotions that I'll give you an example. In the literature, particularly on intimate partner violence, when you can slow down the sequences of events that happen before somebody acts out with either emotional or physical violence, shame's often at the heart of it. Somebody's shame has been activated, and instead of recognizing it for what it is, they reach out or aggress out. And so there's something about that feeling of shame that we want to avoid so much. We'll do everything that we can to do so, and oftentimes that comes at great cost when it comes out as aggression.
So there is a lot of covering up of that, and to compensate for that anger is really the best tool that you have going for you.
Mm-hmm.
Okay.
And it fits with imaging we see. It fits with kind of, I say the board narratives, the storylines. It's an equation that sells. We don't, and we don't see news reports of your neighbor just had an average day and came home and hugged his partner, and that doesn't sell, and so you do tend to see these extreme versions of it. And so and if you don't have those models in your life, and all you do see are the extremes, it becomes, I don't say it becomes accepted, but at least it starts to norm. And so when you're faced with that event or experience, you can tend towards that instead of having some other choices. Instead of saying, well, instead of acting out in anger, here's 2 or 3 things I can do. But when we don't see those around us on a day-to-day basis, either in our personal relationships or at school or in the playground or at work, we're limited in that way.
What would you say about that? It seems within films and a video sometimes that you can see a male portrayed as kind of the macho guy and, very, very strong and with superpowers, versus it seems like the only other type of man that is really shown is the one that is kind of weaker and kind of wimpy and less strong. And there doesn't seem to be a lot that's really in the middle that is appealing and or, brought out within our films and videos.
Sure. Well, and sociologists that study this, and communication study folks and mass media, they'll say, well, the field has expanded a bit, but when you look at how it's expanded, it's not in the ways that you and I would probably like to see. So yeah, you've got the big, powerful, strong hero, and then you've got this kind of weakling who's often feminized in the role. But now you've got what they call the mook, and so that's the lazy, not driven, living in the basement of the parent, and kind of goofy. And you've got the and related to that is the perpetual kind of playboy or frat boy who's not failure to launch in their lives. And so there are more representations of men, but they don't seem to be the kind that we'd say, well, this is the kind of person I want to be, or that I would want to be with. So I think there are some limitations. We're not, as a Western culture, particularly as American, we seem pretty attached to that dichotomous, the black or white, or that kind of thinking, either or. We tend to struggle with that both and. Is it possible to be strong and vulnerable at the same time? Can you have a character that is able to express a wide range of things and adapt to the situation instead of always have to go at it with this kind of stereotype in this narrative?
We are talking with Dr. Ryan McKelly, and we're really talking about the topic of what is a real man and how do we help men become more connected to their true feelings. We're going to take a short break, and I'll be right back with my guest. I'm Dr. Kim Taylor, and you're listening to The Dr. Kim Taylor Show.
You are listening to Dr. Kim Taylor on KZSB AM 1290.
If you are just joining me, we are here talking about how to help boys become more connected men. And I'm here with Dr. Ryan McKelly, a psychologist and associate professor at the University of Wisconsin-La Crosse. When we're talking about helping young boys or men to become more connected with their feelings, what does the research show us about the importance of doing this and helping them to find this kind of social connection and attachment to others?
We're increasingly seeing that it's one of the most critical things. In the attachment theory literature came out many years ago in looking at infant attachment, and it's only kind of built from there. And now we're starting to actually see like physiological links to it as well, and neurological stuff in the brain. We are social creatures. We begin the world as social animals, and so if we live in environments and family environments and work environments that pulls us away from that connection, it puts us at risk in a number of ways. And I always encourage people to think of bio, psycho, and social. So we've got biological risk, psychological, and social risk associated with it. So for example, the social risk, men who tend to be more quote unquote traditional in this way of stoic and not expressing full range of emotions, they tend to have less satisfying relationships. They tend to have greater self-reported social isolation. As far as psychological risk, when you look at substance use and abuse, they tend to have higher rates of it than men and women who have a fuller range of emotional experience and expression. Suicide is one of the most troubling ones for me as a clinician, is the suicide rate. Now, if you look at the highest risk group right now is, European American men in the United States in their middle age, and it's men tend to complete suicides at 4 times the rate of women in complete, even though women may attempt at higher rates. Mm-hmm. And so it has real psychological risk there. And then from a biological standpoint, a lot of people don't recognize this, but one of the things that fascinates me the most is its impact on our cardiovascular system. And a good example is this idea of anger. And so most folks have heard of atherosclerosis, the fatty deposits in our arteries, and then arteriosclerosis, the hardening of them. Research has shown that people who chronically experience cynicism and anger and hostility tend to deposit calcium on their arteries at higher rates than those who have lower hostility. And so it actually impacts the chemistry of our bodies and puts us at greater risk for cardiovascular events. So it isn't this kind of abstract idea. It impacts us on multiple levels.
So by just cutting off from your feelings, it really does have a profound effect on your overall health.
Yeah.
Okay.
And for a long time, and even when I was going through graduate school, in learning more about this and researching it and getting trained in it, this was before the studies started coming out to look at when you mute your feelings, and many of us are capable of doing that, saying, I'm not going to feel this, and I'm not going to feel pain, right? I'm not going to be vulnerable. But studies have come out since then have shown that when you make those decisions, you're also muting your positive experiences. And so these aren't just men who aren't feeling pain or aren't admitting pain. They're also closing their lives to joy and compassion, a lot of those emotions that we associate with positive well-being and the things that draw us and attract us to other people. And so if we're shutting that part down, it also then impacts our ability to connect with others, impacts our ability to connect at work, it impacts our ability to parent, and all over the place.
So it is a huge problem because if we look at this then and then generalize to a full lifespan, it can greatly affect so many areas of your life, including how you feel about yourself, how you feel about life, how you feel about your relationships, and just your ability to feel understood or cared about. That it's very hard to allow others to care for you when you're not allowing yourself to have some of these feelings for people to tend to.
And you know what? Maybe that works out for a very small percentage of people that somehow skirt through life that without any adversity. But I don't know anybody like that. And so, if we're not prepared to handle those things, whether it's job loss, the recession is a good example. 80-something% of the jobs lost were in male-dominated fields. As psychologists, we're kind of sitting there thinking, what's the long-term impact going to be here? On men's well-being. If your sense of self is tied to work and all of a sudden that job's not there, how are you going to deal with it? If you are going to turn to substances or and other kind of negative coping, it's going to go down a bad path. If you're socially isolated and you can't reach out to family and friends to help deal with it, it's going to lead you down a unhealthy path. And so it just closes our opportunities to deal with things as they come and to accept and deal with those wonderful things that happen and be able to recognize those as well.
So what is a role that a male can play that is masculine and yet healthy and allows them to engage in some of these feelings and experiences that we've been talking about?
Well, I get... So even this idea of real men, I've had this discussion with colleagues, kind of the problems with using that language, I would, if you really want to equate what a real man is, we have to call it real human, and really it's just being a full human. I think that's what a real man or a real woman, or however you identify, it's being fully open to the human experience. That includes a very wide range of emotions, not just limiting ourselves to a few. And then some people will throw their arms up and say, well, I don't know how to do that. The wonderful thing about it, and this is the part that I love about doing therapy, is I haven't met anybody who's incapable of learning. And so yes, it might be harder, it might take a lot of work, and we might mess up a lot along the way, but you don't necessarily lose these things forever. And I think that sometimes people fear, like, well, I don't know how to do it, so it's not for me. It takes some patience. I use the example. One of the ways I try to explain it too is naming colors, and this is a little bit of a gender stereotype. If you ask men to list off colors, red, blue, they'll give you these primary ones, and if you ask them to identify shades of red, they'll scratch their head. But you can ask a traditional woman, name, and they can name 15 shades of red. So it's not that those shades don't exist for men. It's just that we haven't necessarily been taught, how to label them and how to interpret them and what to do with them. So a lot of people think, well, I'm born with it, or I'm not, and it's not. It's a set of skills we can learn and unlearn and relearn and those types of things.
So how do we create more opportunities for boys to be more connected this way, or to have a fuller range of feelings and emotions to be able to be more expressive?
It has to happen at every phase in the life cycle, really. And I think a lot of it starts with us as parents or teachers or whatever roles you play. If there's a child in your life, is thinking about how you interact with that child, and it can't just be, well, let's wait for the next generation to figure it out, because it's certainly not going to work that way. Much of when I am working with a man who happens to be a parent, there's a lot of work that has to happen first to say, why is it that maybe as a father, why do I have such a hard time hearing, my son cry at age 9 or something? What does it invoke in me? And once they can get in touch with what they feel and hear it, then they can approach their child with more empathy. And so that's, I think, a part one is how do we reinforce some of these? And I always tell people, I study this. I struggle with it. It's a daily thing. I'm exposed. I'm bathed in the same media as everybody else, and I catch myself. But I have to pause and say, why am I reacting this way, and what are some of the ways that I can interact in a healthier way for me and the people around me. I'll give you just one example though with the way we tend to communicate and solve problems with boys and girls. A communication person gave me this example. So your kid has a conflict at school. Maybe they got bullied or something happened. They come home. On average, with girls, they tend to get questions about how they felt and how it made them feel. Boys tend to get a line of questions that ask them what happened first, what happened next, what did you do? And so if we continue to have a gendered approach to dealing with emotional heartache in our children, so girls tend to then get socialized to communicate with empathy and to accept that feelings are an okay thing to have, whereas that other version, the problem-solving approach tends to teach boys that emotions are to be controlled. And I think we need to do both for both genders. And so we have to communicate in a way that says it's okay, I understand why you feel that way, and let's figure out it. And what can we do next time so you can avoid it or deal with it in a different way. I think we should be teaching people both things. Mm-hmm. And so that's just like one small example, is to be a little bit more inclusive in the way of parenting. And that just gives the example we're capable, even as parents, to do both things. We might just have to be more mindful about how we, if we're biased in the way we parent our children with them.
So if there are women out there that are hearing this, what can we do as mothers, girlfriends, sisters to really help in this process?
It's the same thing I said about men, taking pause and noticing how they react when boys and men may act in a way that runs counter to what their expectation is. And because I hear this a lot when I teach my men and masculinities class to college students, the women in the class will say, "Oh my gosh, I want my boyfriend or my brother, to be this way, but when I see him cry or when I see him express this, I'm uncomfortable." Mm-hmm. And so part of it's, paying attention to our own reactions and ask, am I supporting this in some way, or am I sending subtle cues that this is not an okay way for you to be? So that's that kind of self-work. And so it's really, I'm always encouraging people to just slow down the sequence of it, be more mindful about action and reaction. Particularly with anger. I've never been a fan of the anger management. I'd rather teach people to focus on the milliseconds before anger hit and identify what that feeling was, and then try to understand why anger came and what you could do instead. I'd say the same thing for girls and women. Try to identify what you felt when a man or a boy had kind of violated your expectation of how that, and then choose, if you can, to react in a different way that doesn't shame them and doesn't shut them down, and that does fully support their wide range of experiences as well.
Well,
So.
Well, and I think what would help is that if we can see this as that we can be strong and caring, we can have this aggression and compassion, that it isn't just either or, and to see a whole person rather than just seeing that males need to be a certain way and females need to be a way that makes us comfortable so that we don't have to deal with the discomfort that we might experience.
Absolutely. And I'm glad you said this. Even anger, people sometimes get the wrong idea when I'm talking, or when they hear maybe a snippet about what this is about. They say, well, they get caught in that either or. Well, I'm either going to stand up for myself, or I'm going to, roll over and be a sissy, and I'm going to suffer the consequences. There's no doubt that there's defensive anger might be the right thing in a moment. But I also, I've got a wife. I have no doubt my wife would react with the right kind of anger if one of our children was threatened or I was threatened, right? I mean, we all have the capability to do that. It's just if that's our default, it's not going to work if we're expressing it across different situations. And so I'm not saying you can't be a man the way you've learned to be a man. I think it's helpful to learn other ways to be so you have a choice. And I have to give my wife credit. She calls it the Swiss Army knife approach to life. So when I need compassion with my daughters, for example, I can pull that out. When I need to, solve some problem or be calm under some type of stress, I can pull that out. If I need to sew a button on some clothing, I can do that. If I need to mow the lawn, I can do that. But there's no reason why those things should belong to men or women. I don't see the downside to learning to be adaptable.
Right.
And that's what I try to encourage people to think about.
Right. So it really shows that it's so important to normalize all emotions and to teach that they don't have to be gendered in any way.
Yeah.
Okay.
Absolutely.
Yeah, and I like that idea about having the skills and tools when you need it and knowing which one to use with whatever situation you're confronted with.
And that's a metaphor I use a lot with men because once I mentioned it before, and it certainly wouldn't be a surprise to you either. When you say, well, we're going to work on, opening up your emotional experience and encourage you to feel things that you never felt before, a lot of guys say, I'm not going to do that. But when I always try to reframe it and say, I'm not asking you to stop being who you are, but here are some things that you might not know how to do yet that you're going to learn how to do, and it's going to help you. And seeing it as skills and not, because a lot of people say, I don't give up who I am. You're telling, you're going to ask me to, not be a man in my friendships or not be a man in my relationship. I said, well, no, I'm going to hopefully help you find some other ways to enhance those relationships and be fully present in it.
So I really like your concept that the nature of a real man is really to be a whole man, to have all kinds of feelings, all kinds of emotions, and be really good at when and how to use them. Mm-hmm.
And I know you're familiar with this as well. It's easy and sometimes fun and interesting to talk about gender differences and sex differences in research. But when you look at Janet Hyde's, they did a mega-analysis. It was a meta-analysis of a meta-analysis. So they took all, I think it was 1 million something data points and looked at differences between men and women. And we are about 90 to 95% similar across all these measures. And so while there might be some of these very obscure neurological differences in spatial rotation, right? I mean, so there might be, I'm not saying that these things don't exist. And on average that, we have different levels of hormones and tendencies. But when you look at 90 to 95% of overlap across all these measures, and we are far more similar, but we seem to be hung up on that 5% difference. And then that drives a lot of the imagery and stereotypes and expectations we have about men and women. In many ways, not with positive outcomes.
What would you say that are some of the social changes that we can make in order to help us to get to this point?
One is, I don't know how much you've paid attention to this idea of touch, human touch. And we're getting more and more data come out of it, particularly with the neuroscience research. One of my favorite sets of studies was done by an anthropologist back in '75, and then a follow-up in 1990. Looked at 100 and something different cultures and correlated the degree of violence and aggression in a culture with their degree of infant touch. And so cultures that tend to be low touch, and the United States is one of them, tend to have some of the highest rates of violence and aggression. And this goes back to that attachment. And so, very simple ways, you see a lot of parents, men in particular, fathers in particular, withdrawing from physical affection with their children, particularly boys, at a young age. So they might be cuddling them when they're very little, but as they get older, they and then you get that kind of nagging cultural script in the background. What are people going to think? We've over-sexualized touch, and so there's some touch deprivation that occurs that then impacts our ability to learn empathy. I also, it contributes to some of our sexual assault problems too. Men then tend to confuse touch with sexuality, and so that's like one concrete way is to learn to reconnect with that. It's been part of us, part of our human fabric for a long time, and we accept it and understand it in certain contexts, but we tend to be very touch phobic with boys.
Mm-hmm. One of the other things is about trying to redefine what courage is. Can you speak more about that?
Yeah, and I talk about that in that TEDx talk, and I appreciate you mention it. It's we've got a false idea of what courage is, and so we equate courage with being stoic and not showing any emotion in the face of danger. And I will always say that there are going to be times when that's called for, but that generally doesn't fit a true definition of courage, and to put your heart out there and to be heart-led and heartfelt. What takes courage is to be vulnerable, and that may include, now it doesn't always mean being sad or showing sadness. Being vulnerable could be putting love out there, putting compassion out there. Courage is being okay with being fully human without fear of how it's going to be judged by other people. The safe way is not to show anything, because then you're not putting yourself at risk at all. It's controlled, and people can move on. Real courage is taking those small risks, and some kinds maybe bigger risks of being vulnerable and open yourself up to a much wider range of experiences.
I am here with psychologist Dr. Ryan McKelly, and we've been talking about what is the nature of a real man. I will be right back after this break. I'm Dr. Kim, and you're listening to The Dr. Kim Taylor Show.
You are listening to Dr. Kim Taylor on KZSB AM 1290.
My guest for the hour is Dr. Ryan McKelly, and we have been talking about how to help young boys connect to their feelings, and then how as men to use them in a productive way. So, Ryan, can you give us an example for men about how to take some small risk within their own relationships to be able to express themselves more fully?
Sure. I'll give that example, and then another way of recognizing how men communicate and boys that can help too. So when I suggest that men become more open to this, a lot of them say, "Well, I don't even know where to start." And I think, well, start with your friendships, and think of or your family members. Think about the relationship that's already withstood a lot of different challenges and trials throughout its existence. And that's low-hanging fruit. Tell that person, if you feel love for a male friend, take a small risk. And now, if you're not ready to use the L word, to say, I've known you for 10 years, and I've never said this to you, but you mean a lot to me, and I'm glad you're in my life. And sometimes just giving that language to men and say, I could never say that, or I've never said that. Well, try it. See how your friend responds. And I've tried to do this over the years with friends, people I've known for 20 years, and it was hard. And I use an example of my college roommate. Now we talk maybe a couple times a year on the phone, but I now say, I love you at the end of it. I never could have said that, but that's how I feel, right? I'm communicating that honestly, and I try to be more mindful of what people mean to me and let them know that. And so sometimes it's just finding that relationship that is the lowest risk. Maybe they give you grief for it initially, but often there'll be that silence and that pause, and someone will say, "Oh, you know what? I feel the same way," or no one's ever said that to me. Thank you. But to try that and try one where they're not going to go away. Don't tell all your coworkers, right?
Mm-hmm.
But find that relationship you can trust. The other thing I do is recommend recognizing that shoulder-to-shoulder communication. So oftentimes men get, the idea of sitting face to face with somebody, and this is where I think the culture of therapy can be problematic for some men. That can be confrontational, sitting face to face and asking questions. And there's been some studies that looked at communication with boys and girls, and boys will communicate just as much when you're sitting, driving the car next to them. And so one way to do it is to go for a walk or sit next to them and play video games. It's not that they're incapable of doing, but that takes some of that kind of intensity out of that emotional connection. So there's ways, and so it's if you're not going to look at me face to face, don't give up. There's other ways to begin those conversations. So to recognize that shoulder to shoulder is an acceptable way for some men to communicate, and it's a good first step.
We have about 60 seconds left. Why do you think that this topic is so relevant now?
Well, one, I think we're struggling with the idea of connection. We're getting more electronically connected, and I think in many ways much more disconnected as a result.
Mm-hmm.
I think our exposure to media violence, or just violence in general, when you look at the 200 and some mass shootings that have occurred in the last 300 years, all but 3 have been committed by boys or men. And I think we're getting much more, and we're starting to ask those questions like, why is it? I mean, girls are raised in a gun culture too. Why are they not making these choices? So I think we're seeing more of it. I also like to be cautious, though. It's most men do not do this. Most men are not like this. Most men are just fine. But I think we're starting to see more exposure to those extremities. We're trying to figure out what's going on. Lifespan differences. Men in the U.S. die 5 years earlier than women. It's 12 years in Russia. And so I think we're starting to pay attention to what's going on here and what can we do.
I have been talking with Dr. Ryan McKelly. Would you give us your website in case people would like to reach you?
I don't currently have one. They can find me on www.uwlax.edu, and so my professional information is on my faculty page.
Okay, great, and I will post that on my website too. Ryan, thank you very, very much for being on. I think this is a great topic, and I think that we can all learn from this. So thank you very much for being with us.
Thanks for the work you do, and I really appreciate the time together.
All right, thank you. I will be right back with some few short comments.
You are listening to Dr. Kim Taylor on KZSB AM 1290.
Thank you for joining me today. If you would like to contact Dr. Ryan McKelly, I will certainly post his information on my website at drkimtaylorshow.com. You can also listen to the rebroadcasts of the show Thursday evenings at 10 p.m. and Sunday mornings at 9 a.m. right here at KZSB AM 1290. Also, you can find my past shows by going to iTunes and downloading the free weekly podcasts, or you can now find them on my YouTube channel. Again, just go to my website for the links at drkimtaylorshow.com. And of course, if you'd like to contact me, you can do so at drkim at Dr. Kim Taylor Show. I want to thank my engineer, Mark Giles, and I want to let you know that I will be back here next Thursday, next week, same time at 5 o'clock as I am every Thursday afternoon. So until then, remember, nobody else has to change in order for you to feel better. I'm Dr. Kim Taylor. I'll see you next week.